Look, I'm not saying the Galactic Medical Station was fancy, but when your workplace orbits a planet that's basically a giant emerald floating in space, you know someone's compensating for something. The station itself looked like someone had crossed a luxury cruise ship with a medical textbook, all gleaming chrome surfaces and impossibly clean corridors that practically hummed with superiority. Dr. Vex Thornquill had been working there for exactly 8 months, 2 weeks and 3 days. Not that he was counting or anything. He was just the only human trauma surgeon in a facility staffed by beings who thought his medical degree came from a cereal box. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong, considering how Earth universities looked compared to the Galactic Medical Academy on Proxima Prime. The morning started like any other, with Vex grabbing what the station cafeteria generously called coffee from a machine that probably cost more than his entire medical school education. The liquid tasted like regret mixed with artificial enthusiasm, but it had caffeine, and that's all that mattered when you're surrounded by colleagues who think your species discovered fire last Tuesday. Dr. Clix Fizzlebottom, the Arcturian chief of medicine, glided past on what could only be described as medical hover shoes, because apparently walking like a normal person wasn't sophisticated enough for someone with 17 advanced degrees and a superiority complex the size of Jupiter. "Ah, Dr. Thornquill," Clix said, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for addressing slow children and pet rocks. "I trust you've reviewed the new protocols for bioharmonic cellular reconstruction?" Vex took a long sip of his not coffee. "You mean the one where we wave crystals at patients and hope really hard?" The temperature in the corridor dropped about 10 degrees. Clix's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, which was apparently the Arcturian equivalent of counting to 10 before committing murder. "The bioharmonic resonance therapy has a 97.4% success rate across 14 galactic sectors," Clix said, each word delivered with surgical precision. "Perhaps if your species had evolved beyond percussive maintenance, you would understand the elegance of non-invasive healing." "Percussive maintenance," Vex repeated, grinning. "I like that. Very technical." Before Clix could respond with what was undoubtedly going to be a lecture on human barbarism, the station's emergency klaxons started wailing. Not the gentle chimes that meant someone had stubbed their toe, but the full-blown air raid sirens that meant something had gone spectacularly wrong in the kind of way that made insurance companies weep. "Emergency alert," the station's AI announced in a voice so calm it was practically sedated. "Massive cargo vessel collision detected in Sector 777 Alpha. Multiple casualties inbound. All medical personnel report to Trauma Bay immediately." Vex cracked his knuckles, a sound that made Clix physically recoil. "Well, looks like it's time for some percussive maintenance." The Trauma Bay erupted into controlled chaos, which was really just regular chaos with better lighting and more expensive equipment. Alien medical personnel scurried around like someone had kicked over a very organized anthill, all of them speaking in the kind of hushed, reverent tones usually reserved for libraries and funeral homes. Nurse Pip Whistlebonk, a centaurian who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a nervous breakdown, practically vibrated with anxiety as she checked and rechecked the bioharmonic resonance chambers. "Dr. Thornquill," she chittered, her compound eyes darting between him and the approaching rescue shuttles. "Perhaps you should observe today. Learn from our more advanced techniques." Vex pulled on his surgical gloves with a snap that echoed through the bay like a gunshot. "Oh, I plan to learn something today. Question is, what are you all going to learn?" The rescue shuttles docked with the kind of precision that suggested their pilots had done this dance before. Unfortunately, from the looks of the casualties being wheeled in, this particular dance had involved a cargo freighter, an asteroid field, and what appeared to be a spectacular failure of both physics and common sense. Captain Zort Blinkenheimer was the worst of the lot. The Rigellian trader looked like someone had put a walrus through a blender, then tried to reassemble it using only duct tape and wishful thinking. His blue-green skin had gone an alarming shade of gray, and the various monitoring devices attached to him were making sounds that no medical equipment should ever make in polite company. Massive internal hemorrhaging. Dr. Clix announced, his hover shoes carrying him around the patient like a medical ballet dancer. Severe cranial trauma, multiple organ failure, and what appears to be complete cardiovascular collapse. In other words, Vex said, checking the readouts with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from being right about something terrible, he's dying. Erection, Click said, activating what looked like a combination between a tuning fork and a disco ball. He is experiencing temporary biological discontinuity. We shall restore his cellular harmony through graduated bioharmonic intervention. The device hummed to life, bathing Zort in a light that shifted through colors that probably didn't have names in any human language. Other alien medical staff gathered around with their own instruments, creating what looked like the galaxy's most expensive light show. For 20 minutes they waved, hummed, and resonated at the dying Rigellian. Crystals were consulted. Energy fields were harmonized. Someone even brought out what appeared to be a medical harp, because apparently dying wasn't dramatic enough without a soundtrack. Dr. Quill Nebelton, a Syrian neurologist with more tentacles than seemed strictly necessary, worked over Zort's head with instruments that defied both description and probably several laws of physics. Brainwave patterns are stabilizing in the theta-delta confluence. He announced with the confidence of someone who had no idea what he was talking about but sounded very important doing it. Cardiovascular resonance achieving synchronization, added Dr. Fizz Sparkbottom, a vegan cardiologist whose name sounded like a children's cereal, but whose medical credentials were supposedly impeccable. For a moment it actually looked like it might work. Zort's skin color improved slightly, going from corpse gray to merely dying gray. The monitors stopped screaming quite so hysterically. Even Vex had to admit, grudgingly, that the alien medicine was impressive. Then everything went to hell in a handbasket made of irony and poor timing. The monitors flatlined with the kind of steady tone that meant exactly one thing in any language, on any planet, in any galaxy. Zort Blinkenheimer, stubborn Rigellian traitor, and apparently part-time crash test dummy, was dead. The alien medical staff stepped back from the table with the kind of solemn dignity usually reserved for state funerals and really awkward dinner parties. "We have done all that is medically possible," Dr. Clicks announced, his four eyes blinking in what was probably the Arcturian equivalent of a moment of silence. "The patient has achieved biological conclusion. Time of death," Dr. Nebelton added, consulting what looked like a pocket watch crossed with a calculator. 1437 hours, station time. Nurse Pip began the process of shutting down the various machines, her movements careful and reverent. The other staff started discussing the paperwork that would need to be filed, the notifications that would need to be sent, and the various bureaucratic procedures that apparently followed death throughout the galaxy. Vex looked at the monitors, then at Zort, then at his colleagues who were already moving on to the next patient. "That's it?" he asked. "I beg your pardon?" Dr. Clicks replied. "That's it? You're just giving up?" The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either enlightenment or violence. In this case, it was probably going to be violence. "Dr. Thornquill," Clicks said slowly, "the patient is deceased. There is nothing more to be done." Vex cracked his knuckles again, a sound that seemed to physically pain every alien in the room. "Well," he said, rolling up his sleeves, "that's where you're wrong." The thing about working with aliens, Vex had discovered, was that they had a very different relationship with death than humans did. When an alien patient died, it was treated like a natural conclusion to a story, complete with dignified acceptance and probably some kind of cosmic poetry about returning to the great whatever. Humans, on the other hand, had spent their entire evolutionary history telling death to go take a long walk off a short pier. "Dr. Thornquill," Click said, his voice taking on the tone usually reserved for talking to armed lunatics, "please step away from the deceased." Instead, Vex positioned himself next to Zort's still form and placed his hands on the Rigellian's broad chest. "Pip, I'm going to need you to get me the manual defibrillator. The old-fashioned one, not the singing crystal version." Nurse Pip's compound eyes went so wide they were in danger of falling out of her head. "Dr. Thornquill, the patient is deceased. What you're suggesting is medically impossible." "What I'm suggesting," Vex said, beginning chest compressions with the kind of rhythmic determination that had probably terrified predators back when humans lived in caves, is that maybe, just maybe, your fancy light show missed something. The sound of ribs cracking echoed through the trauma bay like gunshots. Every alien in the room recoiled as if Vex had just started sacrificing goats on the operating table. "He's desecrating the body," Dr. Nebleton whispered, his tentacles writhing in what was probably horror. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat, Vex muttered, tilting Zort's head back and checking his airway. "Come on, you stubborn blue bastard, you've got cargo to deliver." "This is barbarism," Dr. Fizzlebottom declared, though notably he didn't try to stop the barbarism in question. "This," Vex said between compressions, "is cardiopulmonary resuscitation. We invented it back when your species was still trying to figure out which end of a stethoscope was up." "But the patient is dead," Pip chittered, though she was already moving toward the equipment storage with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. "The patient is clinically dead," Vex corrected, pausing only long enough to deliver rescue breaths that made Zort's chest rise and fall. "There's a difference. Clinical death means the heart has stopped. Biological death means the brain has shut down. This guy's brain is still warm, which means we've got maybe 10 minutes before the lights go out permanently." 10 minutes of what? Dr. Clicks demanded. 10 minutes of me being the galaxy's most politically incorrect paramedic, Vex replied, resuming compressions with renewed vigor. "Pip, where's that defibrillator?" The Centaurian nurse returned with a device that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought subtlety was a 4-letter word. Unlike the elegant bioharmonic resonance equipment, the manual defibrillator was built like a medical brick, with 2 paddles connected to a box that probably weighed more than most small planets. "I cannot be party to this desecration," Dr. Clicks announced, though he made no move to leave. None of them did. They stood there watching Vex with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for natural disasters and reality television. "Good thing I'm not asking for your permission," Vex said, taking the paddles from Pip's trembling claws. "Clear the table. And I mean everyone back. This thing doesn't discriminate between dead Rigellian and live Arcturian." The alien medical staff stepped back as if Vex had just armed a nuclear weapon, which, considering the amount of electricity he was about to pump through Zort's chest, it wasn't entirely inaccurate. "Charging to 200 joules, Vex announced, the defibrillator whining like an angry mechanical bee. "If this works, you all owe me dinner. If it doesn't work, you can put death by human stupidity on the medical report." He placed the paddles on Zort's chest, double-checked that everyone was clear, and pressed the buttons. The shock that followed lit up Zort's body like a Christmas tree having an argument with a lightning bolt. The first shock accomplished exactly what everyone expected, which was nothing productive, and a lot of dramatic electrical effects. Zort's body jerked like he'd been hit with a cosmic cattle prod, then settled back into the kind of stillness that suggested death was still winning this particular argument. "See?" Dr. Clicks said with the satisfaction of someone who had just watched his least favorite colleague prove his point through spectacular failure. "The human approach is nothing but primitive brutality." "Primitive brutality that's not done yet," Vex replied, resuming chest compressions. "Pip, charge it to 300 this time." By now, word had spread through the station faster than gossip at a high school reunion. Medical staff from other departments had started gathering in the trauma bay, creating what looked like the galaxy's most morbid spectator sport. Dr. Wiz Poppenheimer from pediatrics stood next to Dr. Buzz Fizzlebang from geriatrics, both of them watching Vex with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for train wrecks and political campaigns. "The human has lost his mind," someone whispered. "Should we sedate him?" someone else suggested. "With what?" came the reply. "Human tranquilizers don't work on them. Something about their brain chemistry being designed by committee." Vex ignored the commentary and focused on the rhythm. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, check for pulse, repeat. It was mechanical, meditative, and probably looked like the most violent form of prayer anyone had ever witnessed. "Charging to 300, Pip announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good girl," Vex said, taking the paddles again. "Everyone clear." And I mean everyone. This one's going to light up the room like a disco ball having a seizure. The second shock was more impressive than the first, if only because it managed to make Zort's body leave the table entirely for about half a second. The monitors registered a brief flicker of activity, then went back to their steady tone of cosmic indifference. Again, Vex said, immediately resuming compressions. Dr. Thornquill, Dr. Nebelton interjected, his tentacles writhing with what might have been concern or nausea. Then surely you must realize that continuing this assault on the deceased serves no medical purpose. The purpose, Vex said between compressions, is that I don't give up on patients just because they're inconsiderate enough to die on my watch. But he's been dead for nearly 15 minutes, Dr. Fizzlebottom protested. 15 minutes of your time, Vex corrected. In my time, he's been having a very brief intermission. Pip, hit me with 400 joules. The collective gasp from the assembled alien medical staff suggested that 400 joules was either impressive or terrifying. Possibly both. 400 is the maximum safe dose, Pip chittered nervously. Safe for who? Vex asked with a grin that probably looked insane under the trauma bay lighting. Him or us? The third shock was less like medical treatment, and more like calling down the wrath of whatever gods were responsible for electricity. Zort's body actually bounced off the table, and for a moment the monitors went completely haywire, not registering everything from cardiac rhythm to what appeared to be the station's lunch menu. Then, in the silence that followed, something remarkable happened. Blip. One single heartbeat, registering on the cardiac monitor like a hiccup in the universe. Did you see that? Vex asked, not pausing in his compressions. Electrical artifact, Dr. Click said quickly. The defibrillator is interfering with the monitoring equipment. Blip. Blip. 2 more heartbeats, weak but undeniably there. Electrical artifact my ass, Vex muttered, feeling for a pulse at Zort's neck. Come on, you blue bastard. You've got about 30 seconds to decide whether you want to be dead or just really, really tired. The monitors began registering a rhythm. Weak, irregular, but definitely not the flat line that had dominated the last 20 minutes. Zort's skin color started improving from corpse gray to merely dying gray to what might generously be called sick but optimistic blue. Then Captain Zort Blinkenheimer, stubborn Rigellian trader, part-time miracle, took a breath that sounded like someone starting a motorcycle in a library. His eyes snapped open, wide and confused, taking in the crowd of alien faces staring down at him with expressions ranging from shock to horror to what might have been religious awakening. What, Zort croaked in a voice like gravel gargling mouthwash, the hell just happened? The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either enlightenment or mass hysteria. Then every alien in the trauma bay started talking at once. Captain Zort Blinkenheimer sat up on the medical table with the kind of confusion usually reserved for people who had just woken up from a particularly vivid dream involving cosmic tax audits and interdimensional customs forms. His blue-green skin had returned to something approaching normal, though he still looked like someone who had recently been hit by a cargo freighter, which was technically accurate. Did someone, Zort said slowly, touching his chest where Vex had been performing compressions, punch me back to life? The alien medical staff exchanged glances that could have powered a small space station. Dr. Clix's 4 eyes were blinking in sequence so rapidly he looked like a malfunctioning Christmas decoration. You were clinically dead for approximately 18 minutes, Dr. Nebelton said, his tentacles still writhing with what was probably existential crisis. According to all known medical science, recovery should have been impossible. Well, Vex said, pulling off his surgical gloves with the satisfaction of someone who had just won an argument with the universe, maybe your medical science needs to get out more. Zort looked around the trauma bay, taking in the crowd of alien faces staring at him like he had just performed the galaxy's first miracle. Which, depending on your perspective, he probably had. I remember the crash, Zort said thoughtfully. Then everything went dark. Then I heard this thumping sound like someone beating a drum made of ribs. That would be Dr. Thornquill performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, Pip explained, her compound eyes still wide with shock. He refused to accept your death. My death? Zort looked at Vex with the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just discovered their insurance premiums. I was dead? Technically, Vex said, you were just resting. Very deeply. The human brought you back through percussive maintenance, Dr. Click said, the words coming out like he was describing something that violated several laws of physics and probably a few moral principles as well. Percussive maintenance, Zort repeated, then looked at Vex with something approaching admiration. You punched death in the face for me? I punched death in the face for you, Vex confirmed. Within an hour, news of the resurrection had spread through the Galactic Medical Station like wildfire in a paper factory. Within 2 hours, it had reached the hospital ships in the outer system. By the end of the day, half the galaxy was talking about the human doctor who had literally punched life back into a dead patient. Dr. Clicks found Vex in the break room, staring at a cup of not coffee with the kind of satisfaction that came from being spectacularly right about something important. Dr. Thornquill, Clicks said, his voice carrying a note that might have been respect if you squinted at it in the right light. I owe you an apology. You owe me dinner? Vex corrected. We had a bet, remember? The Galactic Medical Council is requesting a full report on your techniques, Clicks continued. They want to understand how human emergency medicine differs from standard galactic protocols. Vex took a sip of his not coffee and grinned. It's simple. When someone dies, you don't give them a beautiful funeral. You give them chest compressions and electric shocks until they get tired of being dead. But the violence of it, Dr. Fizzlebottom said, appearing in the doorway like a medical specter. The brutality. Surely there must be a more civilized approach. Civilized, Vex repeated, laughing. You know what's not civilized? Giving up on someone because they're inconsiderate enough to die. You know what is civilized? Refusing to let death win just because it showed up to the party. News of the incident reached Earth within a week, where the medical community greeted it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discovering new forms of coffee or finding parking spaces. Human doctors across the galaxy suddenly found themselves fielding requests from alien colleagues who wanted to learn aggressive intervention techniques. The Galactic Medical Council, after much debate and probably several committee meetings that could have been emails, that officially recognized cardiopulmonary resuscitation as a valid medical procedure. They also issued a statement noting that human medical practices, while unconventional, had proven surprisingly effective in cases where conventional wisdom suggested futility. Captain Zort, for his part, made a full recovery and returned to his cargo runs with a new appreciation for both life and the stubborn refusal of humans to accept defeat. He also started carrying a basic first aid kit, though he privately doubted anyone else would be crazy enough to punch death in the face twice. 6 months later, the Galactic Medical Station had become the most popular medical facility in 3-star systems, not because of its fancy equipment or elegant procedures, but because it was the only place in the galaxy where you could get punched back to life if things went sideways. Dr. Vex Thornquill found himself in the unique position of being the galaxy's most famous medical barbarian. His techniques had been studied, analyzed, and reluctantly incorporated into medical curricula across 17 different worlds. The Galactic Medical Academy had even created a new course called Aggressive Life Preservation, though they still refused to call it by its human name. Dr. Thornquill, Nurse Pip, called from across the trauma bay, her voice no longer chittering with nervous energy. We have an incoming emergency. Multiple casualties from a mining accident on Rigel 7. What's the status? Vex asked, pulling on his surgical gloves with the snap that had become his signature sound. The rescue teams have declared 3 of them deceased, Pip replied. The local medical staff has requested human intervention. Vex grinned. Tell them we'll be right there. And Pip. Neck. Yes, doctor. Charge the defibrillator. Dr. Clicks appeared at Vex's elbow, his hover shoes making their usual soft humming sound. Dr. Thornquill, the Andromedan Medical Consortium has requested another demonstration of your techniques. They're offering to pay for the privilege of watching you work. They want to pay to watch me beat people back to life? Vex asked. Apparently medical tourism is becoming quite popular, Clix replied. There's something about human emergency medicine that other species find both horrifying and fascinating. Probably because we're the only species in the galaxy stupid enough to argue with death, Vex said, heading toward the shuttle bay where the incoming casualties would arrive. Is that really how you see it? Clix asked, keeping pace with his human colleague. Vex paused at the airlock, considering the question. You know what I learned from working with you all? Every species in the galaxy has figured out how to die gracefully. Humans are the only ones who figured out how to live stubbornly. The rescue shuttle docked with its usual precision, and the casualties were wheeled into the trauma bay with the familiar choreography of organized medical chaos. 3 of them were indeed declared dead by the rescue teams, their alien physiology having succumbed to the kind of industrial accident that made insurance adjusters weep. But Vex had learned something important over the past 6 months. Death wasn't the end of the story. It was just the universe's way of saying try harder. As he positioned himself over the first patient and began chest compressions, he could hear the familiar sounds of alien medical staff gathering to watch the show. There would be gasps of horror at the violence of it, muttered conversations about human brutality, and probably someone taking notes for their dissertation on primitive medical practices in post-colonial space. But there would also be heartbeats. There would be gasps of life returning to supposedly dead lungs. There would be eyes opening in confusion, and voices asking what the hell had just happened. And there would be Dr. Vex Thornquill, the galaxy's most famous medical barbarian, proving once again that sometimes the best way to save a life is to be too stupid to know when to give up. Because that's what humans do. They punch death in the face and ask questions later. And apparently the galaxy was finally starting to appreciate the value of a good, old-fashioned argument with the inevitable.